Welcome to the Humanism Now podcast. I'm your host, James Hodgson. Curiosity is woven through humanist philosophy, from the ancients to modern movements, prioritizing learning from evidence, re-inquiry, and critical reflection. It's considered not just a virtue, but an important intellectual and moral quality that helps us care for each other and our world. This week, we explore curiosity, not just as a nice-to-have trait, but as an active practice. We're joined for this week's episode by Dr. Julie Pham, a social scientist, author of The 7 Forms of Respect, and CEO of CuriosityBased, a training company empowering organizations and leaders to practice and benefit from curiosity. Dr. Pham is an award-winning leader who applies her community-building experience to strengthen teams. She's also a TEDx speaker, former journalist, and non-profit executive who holds a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Julie Pham, thank you so much for joining us on Humanism Now.
James, thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's dive straight in. What is curiosity? Can you help us define how you teach curiosity and how we should think about it in a more proactive manner?
So a lot of people think about curiosity as a trait, as the desire to learn something. I actually think of it as a practice, and it's something that we do, and sometimes we don't do it. And it boils down to 3 elements, this practice: self-awareness, relationship building, and clear communication.
Perfect. So could you break those 3 elements down for us a little bit?
Yes. So the first element is self-awareness. So that's actually about practicing inward curiosity. Why do I think what I think? What am I thinking? What's that based on? The second is relationship building. So that means how to get curious about other people, to ask them questions, and to also share ourselves. So, for example, James, it's not just about me asking you questions. I also have to share with you about myself, and then you're going to have reactions to what I share. And that back and forth, we're practicing reciprocity there. And that is the basis of relationship building. And then the third element is clear communication. So this is, how do I listen to understand? How do I ask questions when I don't understand? And how do I tell specific examples and stories? Not to speak in theoreticals and abstracts.
That's fascinating. And so in your experience teaching the practice of curiosity, do you find that there's commonalities in terms of which of those 3 types of curiosity most people are good at practicing? Or can it vary quite a lot?
It can vary. And also there's what people think for themselves and what they think for others. One of the things I do when I go into organizations is I will actually do some real-time polling. And I ask people these different factors. How would you rate, or what do you think is lacking among your colleagues? And so it's make time for self-reflection, build new relationships, deepen existing relationships, listen to understand, ask questions when we don't understand, tell specific examples and stories. So all of those align to what I just shared around self-awareness, relationship building, clear communication. And then I ask them, what are you lacking? And so James, what I often see people say is, other people, my colleagues, there's a real lack of listening to understand. And yet that is consistently the thing that is rated the lowest for themselves in terms of, I don't have a problem with listening. People, they don't think that they're lacking that. Yet they think consistently others are lacking that. Something that people will say that they are lacking is making time for self-reflection. And that is that self-awareness part. And that's because our world is so busy. So those are the things that are pretty consistent, is other people don't listen, but I listen. I can make more time to self-reflect. And the way that people typically react to that when I then debrief with organizational leaders, with the managers, is they think, oh, we got to fix this. How do we get people to listen better? And I then say, no, actually, let's understand, what do they mean by listening? And why do people not feel listened to? Because clearly people feel that they are listening to their colleagues, and yet they don't feel that they are listened to. And so in that, what does that mean? Does that mean that they think that being listened to means I get what I want? I see change. So this kind of gets to how, instead of listening as a problem to solve, to look at this and say, what is this teaching us? And so even to get curious about that.
It's very interesting. And it sounds from what you've explained as well that for most of us, when we undertake this exercise, we're still thinking about, if the point that we mostly criticize in ourselves is not making time for our own self-reflection, that's still not necessarily showing empathy and curiosity for others. And actually it's saying, so we're very good at spotting when we don't feel heard, as you say, or where others may be lacking in curiosity. But if our own self-criticism is we're not paying attention to ourselves, it's still very self-oriented. So it sounds from what you've explained that curiosity is very tied to empathy and compassion for others.
Absolutely, because we also have to practice curiosity with ourselves. And so I think that is actually something that is lacking, that also people say that they don't make time for. And it's just because go, go, go. And they're thinking of, how do I fix this? How do I get to the next step? And we don't pause to say, why am I even feeling this way? A lot of my work is also around respect, and how respect is relative and it's objective. And a lot of that actually has to do with, how do we get curious around respect? And so people will say, oh, other people, I'm being disrespected. And yet what we don't say is, why am I even bothered by this? How do I want respect? What's that based on? What experiences in my life have informed how I even have this expectation? For example, some people get really bothered when people don't use honorifics. And others, that's not a big deal. That is actually cultural. That is shaped by our experiences. So to even understand that is helpful to then understand, why am I bothered by not getting this thing that I think everyone should know, everyone should do, and yet that other person might not have that experience. And it's not in the US, people will even call their parents by their first names. And in some cultures, you would never do that. Oh my gosh, you would never do that. In Vietnamese, I'm Vietnamese American, hierarchy is embedded in my language. I am only who I am in relationship to someone else. So I'm always trying to figure out, are you older than me? Are you younger than me? Are you older than my parents? Are you younger than my parents? Do I call you older aunt or younger aunt? Do I refer to myself as older sibling or younger sibling? And so hierarchy is embedded in my language. And that influences how I think about hierarchy, which it's not that big of a deal. And yet in some places, it's just, hierarchy is considered bad.
That would mean really this practice of curiosity should be present throughout every interaction, every engagement. I imagine if you know someone incredibly well, by that point, you probably are in a position to be able to work on assumptions. But it sounds like, with every new person that you meet, you have to restart this process and this practice again. So I wonder then, what daily habits do you teach or practices do you teach to intentionally build this practice of curiosity and to instinctively act with curiosity?
The biggest one is just pausing. Before we jump, just actually pause and even take stock of, how am I feeling about this? And sometimes it can actually be really helpful to write it down. And then to go, it's not just one feeling. There could actually be multiple feelings here. And sometimes it actually takes us a while to get to the feeling that might be very vulnerable to share. I'll give you another example. I was having a disagreement with someone, and this lasted months. And by the way, another thing is, James, it takes time. It's not going to be resolved right away, and just acknowledging that. So I was having a disagreement with someone where I thought I told them something, and then they didn't do the thing that I told them. And I just couldn't understand why. And so we were just talking past each other, because even though I was saying, why did you do this? What I was really asking was, how could you possibly have done this when I told you not to? What I really wanted was them to admit that they were wrong. That's what I was really listening for. And so I had to even get to a point where I could acknowledge that, right? Because in my mind, I'm practicing curiosity. I want to know why you did it. And I also wanted you to admit that you did it and that you were wrong, because that person, when I asked them why they did it, they would talk about why they were justified to do it, which is a different thing. And my first reaction, my first feeling was I felt wronged. And where I had to go to was I felt hurt and I felt betrayed. And that's a lot harder to admit. And once I got to that part, I was actually able to return to the conversation, and I was able to ask different questions. And this time I shared, hey, I said this and this and this. When I said this and this, did you hear me? Yeah, I heard you. Did you believe me? No, I didn't believe you. Oh, okay. That's not about me. I can't help it if that person didn't believe me, because there are all these other reasons in their life that have them decide what they believe or they don't believe. That's beyond my control. But James, it took me months to get to that place of asking and breaking down and asking different questions. So in terms of what are some daily habits, pause, and then also just recognize that it's going to take time. And the other thing is, throughout all of this, I was sharing with other people, and I wasn't sharing in a way, validate me, make me, wasn't she wrong? It was actually, how do I see this differently? And because I think that's actually one mistake that people make. They share with people and they're just looking for validation. And maybe in the beginning, that's what we need. We need to be soothed. But at some point, we have to decide, are there other ways of seeing this? And to ask people for that. And you're not asking them to solve the problem or to give you advice. And that's another thing. Don't give me advice. Just help me try to see this in a different way.
Yes, that desire for validation is very strong. And I can see that's the first thing to overcome. And accepting that that does take time as well. I think allowing yourself the space for those feelings. But I do love this idea that actually comes down to understanding first what you want from the situation and then designing the questions around that rather than, as you say, just going in for what we might think of curiosity, which is I'm just going to ask questions to understand this person's point of view, because that isn't going to solve the root problem.
The question that I think I'm asking might not be the question I actually want answered. And because so often the questions that we ask are often laden with our own assumptions and what we think that person already understands. And so for us to even just be willing to acknowledge, hey, however I'm asking this question, maybe I've got to try different ways of asking this question, because it's not just about, oh, they're not hearing the question. This is the thing. I had to no longer, in that example I shared with you, I was conflating hearing and believing. And how often do we do that? Oh, well, I emailed you. I text messaged you. I wrote it. Why didn't you do the thing? And we don't ask, well, did you believe me? Did you agree with me? We assume that if we communicate something, that person's going to agree. And I don't think that person actually even was aware of that until I broke it out into two separate questions. So it's not that they were consciously doing, I hear you, but I don't believe you. It was only until I asked the question or questions that we were able to identify, oh, this is what's happening.
So do you advocate for almost starting that conversation not with the questions to the other party, but framing how you feel, your interpretation of the situation, the assumptions that you might be acting on before you then engage with that more fact-finding exercise?
Yeah, so actually we have this structure about approaching difficult conversations with curiosity, and it's got the acronym CAFA, C-A-F-A, and it's to share, hey, here's the context, the action, this is what you did, feeling, this is how I felt about it. And then to also allow for multiple feelings. I feel confused, I feel disappointed, I'm angry, I'm annoyed. And then to ask a question. And sometimes that question, James, is about asking permission to have the conversation. Are you open to hearing how I feel? Are you open to talking about this? Can we talk about this? Sometimes it's a leading question. You were late and I felt dismissed. I felt worried. I felt concerned. Were you helping your mom? Because I know she's sick. And then that says, I know things are going on in your life. I'm not just trying to have you react, because a question will invite a conversation. And there have been times where I want to go in and be like, you were wrong. And then I remind myself, okay, ask a question, because that's an invitation to a conversation. And I have been on that too. Actually, I'll give you an example of someone where I was on that end. Someone came to me, it was a colleague, and I had basically committed to a sponsor, but my colleague was supposed to deliver on it. So I was like, hey, I got us some money. Now you go do the thing. And then she came back and she reminded me, this is what you did, and how can we collaborate? And I realized, oh, that was not very collaborative of me. But if she had said, you just told me what to do, then I would have been defensive. But instead, she asked me, how can we collaborate? And then it gave me a moment to recognize, oh, how did she see this? And then we entered a conversation.
That's great. So just to recap the stages, so it's context,
action, feeling, and then ask. And this is asking for understanding. A lot of times people think that this is asking for change. Can you not do that next time? Now, here's the thing. If they've done it numerous times and you've talked about why it bothers you and all of this, and it's getting in the way of your working together or whatever, then you can ask for a change. In the beginning, though, just ask for understanding, because when I do that, I've been often really surprised by what people say. And it exposes me to different logic. I mean, I'll give you another example of when I lived in Vietnam, and this actually goes to the forms of respect. This was over 15 years ago, so I think things have changed, but people would cancel on me last minute all the time. And I just couldn't understand why. I was just, why don't they give me some heads up so I can do something else? And so I asked a Vietnamese friend, and he said, oh, no. They know. But the reason why they wait last minute is because if they told you ahead of time, that would convey that they were making a choice, and the choice was not to be with you. When they wait last minute, it's an emergency. They can't do anything about it. Oh, so they're being respectful? Yes. James, I never would have come up with that logic. Nowhere in my experience would I come up with that logic. And then it helped me understand, oh, okay, this is just a different logic here. And I'm not saying my logic is better than their logic. And I got to understand.
Understanding those norms. And again, until they're questioned, we don't second guess them ourselves because they are the norms, again, that we're surrounded by. So framing it around, building up to even asking just to have the conversation. And I've certainly found in my experience where approaching a difficult conversation and not knowing what to say, not knowing how to start it, just that question. I'll also add in the context, action and feeling, I think, next time. But even just the process of asking, is this a conversation we can have? Allows that person also the space to explore, okay, why might they want to be having this conversation? What could have been misinterpreted? And you find that the person comes better prepared and is already more curious themselves when that's opened up.
And sometimes you can even ask, is this a conversation we can have? Would you rather have this over text or a phone call? Because I've had people say, let's have this over text. Like, all right, that's okay. Just because I might want to have a voice to voice, if they are more comfortable writing it out, we can do that too. And so even just sometimes asking about the, after asking permission, how would you like to do this? When would be a good time?
And that's setting up a dynamic of respect as well. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, if you went straight in with something more direct or accusational, then you are creating a very adversarial dynamic. But allowing the collaboration to create the framework or the arena that you're going to have this conversation in is already setting the tone of respectful correspondence and negotiation. One of the areas that we end up debating quite a lot or discussing quite a lot within certainly the humanist groups that I'm involved in is around the paradox of tolerance, which I'm sure you're very familiar with in your work. And I wondered how you feel the practice of curiosity plays into that. Do you feel there are some limits to curiosity? There are some views or points or behaviors for which you might say, actually, no, in that instance, you don't need to take the effort to understand the other person's point of view. That's crossing a boundary. I just wonder how you tend to practice that yourself or advise for others.
So I am an extreme relativist. And my training as a historian has really informed this, because whatever we believe to be true now, history will say something later on. And so I take the position of, I really want to understand where they're coming from. I'm going to give an example. I was talking to more of an acquaintance, but it was over dinner. It was a social setting. It was just the two of us. And this was 5-7 years ago or something like that. And we were talking about transgender people. And he said, I just don't believe in that. I don't believe in trans. And because he said, they are choosing this discrimination. And I said, well, I don't think that's the case. I think that they feel that they were born into a gender that's not their own. And so that's why they make this transition. Like, no, I don't believe that. They are choosing this because the way that you were born is the way that you were born. And then he pointed to his skin, to his forearm. And he said, I am a Black man. I am proud of being a Black man. I get a lot of discrimination. I didn't choose that. There are choices. With gender, though, there's a choice. And so that really helped me understand where he was coming from. And it was a logic that I would not have even imagined, because that's not my experience. And so just by entering this conversation and talking about it, I was able to understand where he was coming from. And so when we shut down, we actually deny ourselves of all of these possible reasons that people have. And we could agree to disagree. And yet I got some insight that I couldn't have imagined for myself.
And when you do that practice, does that also help you find and formalize new and potentially better or more persuasive arguments when you encounter similar views the next time?
I mean, I don't think of it in terms of persuasive arguments because I really am open to, I just want to understand where you're coming from. When I hear persuasive argument, I think, oh, I'm trying to persuade you to think one way or another. Whereas I'm really just, tell me what you think. I mean, another thing that was really a huge source of debate was vaccination and anti-vaxxers. And this was amid COVID. And what I saw was a lot of my friends who were loving, caring people were just, people who are anti-vaxxers are this, 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 and this. And yet I talked to people who are anti-vaccination. There was a whole range of reasons. And I got to hear them because I want to understand. I'm vaccinated myself. I don't think that makes me better than you. I made a choice and you've made a choice and I want to understand your choice.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an area we've probably all been involved in fairly strong debates in recent years. And you're right, actually, when you listen to people's arguments on both sides of that, most of them come for either personal concern, certainly concern for their children, but we often frame it as though, as you say, it's more of a selfish decision. But yeah, it's a very sensitive topic to engage with people on. So yes, trying to understand, I can see that being a really hugely important way of building empathy, building trust, building rapport before you can then approach that difficult conversation.
And James, I'll say with that, as I talk to people, I realize we are all scared. We were all scared. And so what was really happening was my fear is more justified than your fear. And that's what we were really arguing about. And fear is so emotional and personal. And yet people would try, oh, let's talk about the science. And at the end of the day, it came down to fear. And then that also has to do with, well, then what makes us feel safe?
And it does seem to be these core foundational desires that actually underpin a lot of very strong beliefs. And I've seen very interesting practices where people do chip away at that to see that actually at the very core layer, as you said, when you try to get what is it I want, what is it I'm feeling, a lot of sometimes very diverse opinions can be driven from very similar or identical emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering as well, obviously we talk about beliefs a lot here. So do you think that curiosity can coincide with holding very strong beliefs? Or do you think that beliefs can get in the way of our ability to practice curiosity?
I think that multiple truths can coexist, and I can believe one thing and someone else can believe another thing. And how do I honor that they believe something else and that their belief doesn't deny my belief? It's just we have different ways. So I'll give you another example. The Vietnam War ended 1975. In the US, they call that the fall of Saigon. In communist Vietnam, where I lived for years, they call it Liberation Day, the day that the North liberated the South. And in the South Vietnamese refugee community that I belong to, we call it the day we lost our country. And all three are true. And they're just different perspectives. So I've actually, in recent years, been referring to myself as South Vietnamese because I want people to understand that we came here as political refugees, not seeking economic freedom. Just a side note here is just in the US, there's this idea of the American dream. With immigration, there's push and pull. Oh, I'm coming here for economic freedom because the US is so great. There are also the push factors of what pushes people to leave their homeland. And so when we center one story in the US, it's like, oh, well, because it's the American dream. We're actually denying the other one, which is people felt compelled to leave. I came with my parents as a 2-month-old boat person. We had a great life. And yet, because of the lack of political freedom, we felt compelled to leave. You know, your question about belief. I lived in Vietnam. My dissertation was about the South Vietnamese communist revolutionary Jan Van Zo, who led the communist revolution against the French in 1945. I heard his beliefs and I honor that. And that doesn't make mine any less valid either.
This idea of holding multiple truths as well, and allowing multiple versions of the truth to be held in either personally or within the dynamic, I think is so important as well. I really take away from this the importance of language, and that, again, I guess coming back to norms, the way in which we describe events, or in fact, our understanding of a particular term and the way it's used could be completely different for someone else, and the assumptions that they may have around the use of language. So it really sounds like you're advocating for an attitude of constant learning, and that there's always more that we can discover when we're engaging in these conversations or practicing curiosity. And I wonder, how has the practice or actively engaging with curiosity in the time that you have, how has that changed your views either on yourself or how you see others?
So I got to tell you that it wasn't actually until I became a community organizer did I start enjoying curiosity as a way to build relationships. Because when I was an academic, I thought of curiosity, oh, I'm a curious person. It was about knowledge accumulation and all kind of also knowledge hoarding in academia. It's like, oh, how do I share all of this and prove other scholars were wrong? And this is why I'm right. And it wasn't until I came back to Seattle and my family has a Vietnamese newspaper and I started doing this. And I realized that, oh, there's also learning and curiosity that can happen just from people around me. And so that I actually am really proud of my very diverse network of friends. I mean, I just celebrated my friend's 80th birthday. She is almost twice as old as me. And I also have friends who are teenagers and so many different ways of diversity. And that's because I've actually, over the past 15 years, really opened myself up to learning through people.
I've heard that's one of the great benefits of forming communities is intergenerational friendships, being friends with people of different generations outside of your family, and also the diversity of people within your group, different views, different experiences, different identities. But that particularly speaking with people from different ages and understanding, because they will have a completely different experience in life, in their upbringing, in their formative years, and what you can learn from that. And I wonder, in your experience, practicing curiosity yourself, but also training others, particularly in organizations, in the workplace, and I can see there's also benefits in personal lives and any organization or group which people are in. What are the other tangential benefits that you've seen when people put these practices into place, or they try to systematically be a more curious organization or group? Are there any other benefits outside of the areas of empathy and understanding that we've discussed?
I'll say that, so I only work with organizations, or workplace, and yet what we are guiding them to learn, because actually I think that this is something they all know. It's just more about how do we have permission to do it? Because in the workplace, sometimes it's solve problem, and we're saying pause and actually look at what this problem is trying to teach us and listen. And they take that and they apply that to their home lives. And that's why, James, I feel so passionate about this work, because school ends and yet learning doesn't end. And the workplace, there's so much opportunity for this to be a learning organization. And if employers can actually let their teams be, okay, we're going to be a learning organization, we're going to continue to learn and adapt here, they will be able to face any challenge that comes up, and they will be able to take that to their home lives too. It's when I work with teams, I can't tell you how many times people say, oh, I never paused and thought about this. And they're then thinking about their conversation with their spouse or with their children or with their friends, and how do they apply that there? We don't get these skills in school. It's kind of survival of the fittest. And yet, if we actually make time in the workplace to do this, benefits the rest of our other parts of our life.
Yeah, I can imagine you've saved many domestic relationships without realizing it. Well, I suspect it's the first thing people think of when they're doing these exercises and we're talking about assumptions and how to approach disputes. It's going to be the people that they're closest with.
And even actually when I guide people through that CAFA structure that I was telling you about earlier, and I actually say, don't come up with an example at work. Think about something outside of work or a past work experience. And the reason why is because I don't want people just to commiserate with one another and validate, oh yeah, I know that person. Because we can be more objective when we're sharing examples that people don't know about. And then it also helps us relate, oh yeah, these come up all the time. I mean, actually, when I hear from someone who's like, I can't think of a difficult conversation I have that I didn't have. that I didn't address. I'm like, really? I wonder if other people would say that about you.
Well, yeah, I'm sure everybody can find a difficult conversation that didn't go the way that they wanted it to. And so before we wrap up, I mean, there's so much useful information that you've shared here that we will include links to everything. And obviously do follow Julie if you want to learn more. And I can strongly recommend accessing the resources or get in touch for the full training. But if a listener is tuning in today and they're contemplating how to approach difficult conversation, or they are trying to understand, what is the one piece of advice you would give someone just to say, here's the first thing you can do to increase your practice of curiosity?
To pause and to ask yourself 2 questions as you're entering this difficult conversation. So the first question to ask is, do I want that person to learn from me? Yeah, that's why I'm going into this conversation, to persuade them. The second question to ask is, am I willing to learn from them? And to answer that question honestly, because I might not be willing yet. I might not be willing to change my mind yet. And if that's the case, then don't go into that conversation, because that means you are just going to be performing listening. And it's okay to not be ready to have that conversation because you are not ready to learn from them about the possibility that you might be learning from them. So go practice with someone. Go practice, what questions could I possibly ask this person? Go talk to your friend about that. Brainstorm questions to ask, not how to get them to do this. And so ask yourself, am I willing to learn from them? And if you are not, do not have the conversation yet.
Brilliant advice. And our final question, what's something which you've changed your mind on, and what inspired that change?
So I actually, just of 3 years ago, was still describing curiosity as a trait. And it was in this publicly humiliating experience where I was presenting on my work and an audience member really challenged it. Did I then start this process of thinking of curiosity as a practice? Because I couldn't understand, well, wait a minute, she's a curious person. How could she say that? How was I feeling about it? And so in that, I used to think of curiosity as a tree, and now I think of it as a practice. And that's actually what I talk about in my TEDx talk, Curiosity as a Practice. And I actually talk about the evolution of how I got there.
So yes, if you'd like to hear the full version of that answer, please check out Julie's TEDx talk. But Dr. Julie Pham, thank you so much for joining us on Humanism Now.
Thank you so much, James, for inviting me.